and what they found was that Black faces were more associated with psychosis compared to mood disorder. They were more associated with the term non-compliance versus compliance, and they were also more associated with the term antipsychotic versus antidepressant. And what was interesting is that this seemed to be affected the higher the level of training you had. So for example, if you look at this bottom row of data, medical students are the reference group. So if you were a psychiatry resident, a fellow, or board certified psychiatrist, you're more likely to see these implicit biases. Likewise, if you were Native American or Black, you were less likely to demonstrate these implicit biases. So how can technology help reduce these disparities? And one idea is that if we could develop more bias-free methods of assessment, that might address some of the biases, stereotypes that can impact how clinicians can misdiagnose folks from marginalized communities. And this is the work that we've been doing here at UIC with a study funded by NIMH called Unmasked, Unobtrusive Monitoring of Affective Symptoms and Cognition using Keyboard Dynamics. And this is a study where, as Eric mentioned, we're trying to link neuroimaging with digital biomarkers and looking at brain networks as defined or derived from neuroimaging with the networks of devices that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And the genesis of this was from my colleague and lab co-director, Dr. Alex Liao. She developed an app called BiEffect, which replaces the default keyboard of your smartphone with a customized keyboard that allows us to track how you type. Importantly, we don't track what you're typing because of privacy and confidentiality concerns, but we do look at how fast you're typing, whether you make mistakes. We look at the frequency of backspace usage and autocorrect rates. And we can use that information to passively and unobtrusively infer aspects of mood and cognition. We were fortunate to partner with Dr. Melvin McInnes and Kelly Ryan at the University of Michigan, working with their Prechter longitudinal study of bipolar disorder to test out this technology in patients who were getting daily mood ratings, as well as weekly clinician rated scales done for depression and mania. And in our first published study with this group, first authored by Dr. John Zulueta, he was able to show that if you put these typing metrics into a regression model, they were highly associated with clinician-rated scales for mania, as well as depression. And when you look specifically at what keyboard features were uniquely associated with depression versus mania, he found that less backspace usage was associated with more manic symptoms, and more autocorrect rate was associated with more depressive symptoms. And work done by Jonathan Stange, shown here, was looking at whether can we see if these typing metrics are not only cross-sectionally associated with depression symptoms, but can they be used to prospectively predict changes in depression? And he looked at instability of mood ratings, shown here in the upper left, as well as instability of typing speed, showed here in the bottom left, to see if they could predict elevations in mood symptoms controlling for baseline symptoms. And he found that, yes, indeed, they do. Both instability of mood ratings, as well as instability of daily typing speed, was able to predict elevations in future depression levels. We were fortunate in that these participants also underwent a neuropsychological battery, including the trail making test parts A and B, as well as the Tower of London task. And we wanted to ask the question whether these typing metrics were associated with aspects of cognition as well as mood. And here's the trail making test as an example. So basically it's a connect the dots task where you either connect numerical dots sequentially, or you alternate between letters and numbers for part B. And these are tests of processing speed and executive function. And in work published by our graduate student, Mindy Ross, she looked at performance on this trail making test in association with key presses. Participants did the trail making test 2 times a day. So she bifurcated the typing data into morning key presses and evening key presses. to associate with the two instances of the trail making test. She controlled for a number of different covariates like time of day, as well as mood and age. And what she found was that between subjects, there was a strong association between typing speed and performance on the trail making test, such that people who performed slower on the trail making test typed slower. And then she also found on the right that this association occurred within the individual as well, so that if you were typing slower on a particular day, your performance on the trail making test was slower on that day. So not only do we see this association between psychomotor processing speed and typing speed between individuals, but we also saw it within individuals. We've also taken a time series approach to the typing data. And so that way we can use a dynamical systems approach, which has been used in a number of different other types of studies, looking at EEG data, looking at heart rate variability, where we can look at the entropy or the regularity of the time series data. And we can formulate the typing data as a time series as shown here, where on the x-axis, you're looking at key presses as a function of the order in which they were pressed. And in the y-axis, we're looking at the time in between each key presses, which represents the typing speed. And we can look at the regularity or irregularity of this time series. And likewise, we can look at the irregularity or regularity of time series looking at moves on the Tower of London task, where the point is to get from this start state shown here on the left to a goal state shown here on the right in as few moves as possible. And we can look at the regularity of times in between each move to see if there's a high degree of regularity or a low degree of regularity, with the intuition that if you thought about how to solve this puzzle in advance, you might have more regular move times because you would have planned it out. However, if you're impulsive and you didn't really think about how to solve the puzzle, you might have a quick first move, realize you messed up, have a slower second move, and so forth. So it would be more irregular, reflective of poor planning. And we can do the same thing with the key presses, right? We can look at the time in between each key press and assess the entropy or regularity of that time series. And our hypothesis was that patients with bipolar disorder who have issues with impulsivity or poor planning should have higher entropy or more irregularity of move times on the Tower of London task. And furthermore, that this would be reflected in the irregularity of their typing. And this is work done by John Bart, shown on the right, and Alexander Demos on the left. And what we found was that indeed, if you look at the entropy of move times on the Tower of London task, participants with bipolar disorder had significantly higher levels of this entropy or irregularity compared to controls. And then the same thing was reflected in the typing dynamics. And here we're looking at entropy across different timescales because the typing data is sampled with a high temporal frequency. So we wanted to make sure that any changes in entropy were not specific to any particular timescale. And we can see that over all the timescales analyzed, that patients with bipolar disorder had significantly higher entropy of typing compared to controls. Furthermore, that typing entropy in participants with bipolar disorder was significantly correlated with the Tower of London entropy, as well as variability of depression symptoms and variability in impulsive actions and feelings. And so this pilot work done with the University of Michigan suggests that we can use these passive, unobtrusive measures derived from typing data to infer aspects of mood and cognition. And so that pilot data went into our application for our current study, Unmasked, where the goal is to recruit participants across the spectrum of mood disorders. And we are trying to see if what we measure on the phone tracks with what we can measure in the brain with regards to neural correlates of cognitive dysfunction that we see in mood disorders. We recruit folks to use the app over a month period. So after a baseline assessment, they use the app for 2 weeks. Then we do neuroimaging, clinical assessments, as well as neuropsychological assessments. And then that whole process is repeated for another 2 weeks to complete the month. And as an example of our hypotheses, we want to see if things like typing speed, which we've previously shown to be associated with processing speed are those related to brain correlates of cognitive dysfunction like network efficiency. And also as well as efficiency in particular key brain regions that we know are associated with these cognitive functions. And here's just an example of some really preliminary data from our first 10 subjects suggesting that this might be the case. We're looking at typing speed on the x-axis versus brain network efficiency. And what you're seeing here is that the more efficient, the higher the efficiency, the faster the typing speed is in support of our hypothesis. So now we're doing some interim analyses to see if this holds up with a larger sample. And the overall goal with this type of work is to see if we can use these passive and obtrusive ways of assessing mood and cognition to intervene early, because as we all know, if you intervene early, we have much better outcomes for our patients. And I think this can also lead the way to more bias-free forms of assessment, which can also improve the care that we provide for patients. So I will stop there, and then I guess we can go into the Q&A portion.
Thank you, Olo. That was great and really exciting. I wonder if I could, with our first question in this conversation part of the seminar, get at that a little bit more, ask you to get out your crystal ball with respect to innovation. What you illuminated there is that using digital biomarkers together with neuroimaging and using things like, for example, the dynamical systems approach and multimodal data gives us not just more data and more convenient data, but new kinds of data that could uncover things about brain disease, which have been difficult to understand with traditional tools, which are often retrospective self-reports. With that in mind, what do you see as key opportunities for innovations in this area? And I'll add a second part of that. What do you see as the relative roles of academia and industry and collaborations between the two in that, in those innovations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a really exciting time. There's a lot of incredible work being done in this space, not only with typing data like we're doing, but people are looking at voice, they're looking at video, they're looking at GPS data, all kinds of ways to passively and objectively sense and get data that might be relevant clinically. And I think where this might be really important is that we've had problems with the way we diagnose patients in psychiatry, because oftentimes we rely on subjective report. Even the criteria in the DSM-5 are in some ways arbitrarily defined, right? So, I think if you ask the creators of the criteria, how did you come up with 2 weeks for a depressive episode, they'll say, well, it just sounded good, right? So there's no sort of data-driven way to that we've arrived at these diagnoses. And I think by getting this amount of data, by applying innovative new methods from machine learning, artificial intelligence, there might be ways to create novel diagnostic criteria that have more relevance in terms of treatment selection, treatment outcomes, prognosis, that are much better than what we have now. So that's where I see this going. And then I think with the interface with industry, we might get to this later, but one of the exciting things about trying to commercialize this is sort of moving things at a much more rapid pace than they occur in academia. And also the focus on real world outcomes, things that, measures that matter, whether it's for large scale healthcare systems down to the actual patient level. I think that's where industry can play a really important role, because they want to invest in things that are going to have an impact, things that are going to make a difference, that lead to a better bottom line in that sense. And that's actually aligned with much better outcomes, much better treatments for patients.
Thank you. That's a great answer. You talked about a little bit about commercialization, and I think this is something of widespread and market interest at this university and probably every other one. And I, keeping in mind that you did your MD, PhD at Stanford as well, and so you must have learned some of the tools of the trade there. Can you walk us through, if you could, some of the first steps that you took when you realized your research could lead to a commercial product?
Yeah, I think the idea behind commercialization actually came sort of externally. So when I would present this, or my colleague Alex Liao would present it, people would approach us and assume we already had a company around this, or asked about, about our company before it actually existed. We also got inbound interest from pharmaceutical companies that wanted to work with us. So it seemed like a natural evolution of our work to form this company. And then that involved then working with our university and our Office of Technology Management, which has been challenging. I would say there's some institutions that have a better track record of university spinoffs and faculty initiated startups that have a whole infrastructure in place. You mentioned that I went to Stanford, and I was just back there a couple weeks ago for my reunion, and they have purchased an entire sort of industrial park that used to house Theranos. But they've made this space available for all their faculty, and they have lab space and everything, just so they've really sort of greased the wheels at Stanford to make it easy for faculty to start companies. Other institutions may not have that track record or that experience, or they might be more used to licensing out their IP to larger pharmaceutical companies. And sometimes what's needed for a faculty startup is not the same way you would handle licensing for a large pharmaceutical company. And so there have been some challenges and some friction along the way, but we were able to get a decent licensing deal from our university. And that's another issue, is sort of managing conflict of interest, because when you're trying to negotiate between the company and the university, sometimes it's good not to be involved or not to be stuck in the middle of those negotiations.
Thank you. I'll just remind everyone at WashU that when we had Dedrick Carter, our new Vice Chancellor for Innovation and Chief Commercialization Officer, do a seminar, he told us something similar to what you just said, Olu, which is first call should be to the Office of Technology Management. If you think you have an idea, if you think you have something commercializable, I don't know that we have a former Theranos here for good and bad to repurpose as an innovation hub for faculty, but we certainly do have others. I just have one last question, which draws on what you were just talking about in terms of challenges, and then I'm going to turn things over to the audience, who no doubt has many questions. What has been your biggest challenge so far? And I'm curious if you have a solution for that challenge as well.
Yeah, I would say, and I think one of our co-founders is in the audience, Dr. Rianne Moore, and she might also have some additional thoughts. But we've had this sort of grand plan to go from a research grade project to a commercial grade product, right? And the things that work for a research study may not work when you're trying to develop a consumer grade product, right? So things like the user interface, the user experience, which you might not care as much about when you're trying to develop a tool for research, really matters when you're trying to develop something that you want to sell, right? That you want people to pay for. So that's one challenge. And the other one is also just trying to think about what is the most appropriate business model, especially when you're developing a tool that's basically a measurement tool and has a multiplicity of use cases. You can't go for all of them. You have to narrow down and focus. And so the other challenge has been, we've developed this tool which can be used at the consumer level by a patient for self-monitoring. It can be used by a clinician for measurement-based care. It could be used by a pharmaceutical company to develop more objective outcomes for the drugs under study. So how do you, who is your customer? What is your business model? And answering those questions are very crucial first steps in any startup.
Thanks. You really provide, I think, a template for others in the field, particularly people, including people at WashU who are trying to make similar forays. I'm going to turn things over now to the audience. I know there are a number of people who have questions. I see someone has their avatar hand up if they want to go first.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. I thought that was a great presentation. I have a question that you probably addressed in the papers, but I'm curious about how you handled it. Nowadays, people get distracted a lot, and I could envision people opening the app, going halfway through, and then getting distracted by a phone call or talking to other people, and then going back to it later, or potentially having, I guess, noise related to other distractions that were present. And I was curious about how you handled those observations, if there was a way to identify them, and use a certain threshold to kind of as a cutoff for those, because it would, I think, alter your results, I would imagine. So
yeah, so because we're capturing data at such a high degree of granularity, and we're capturing data not just when somebody is using the app, but basically anytime you engage a keyboard. So whether you're texting or looking up something online, anytime you're engaging your keyboard on the phone, we're collecting data. And so when we process the data, we can look at how long somebody was typing. We can filter things by the length of the session. So if you have interrupted sessions that don't provide enough data at the session level, those can be filtered out. So there's all kinds of ways that we can look at the data, since we're sampling it at a high temporal frequency while somebody is typing. So I hope that addresses your question.
yeah, it did. I guess to get a little bit into the weeds, how do you make that determination of cutoffs for it? Do you think there's a clear cutoff for those things when you were looking at the data?
So there are all kinds of ways we can look at the distribution of inter-key delays, and based on the distribution of the data, you can decide what the appropriate cutoffs are. You can just decide that, if the session length is, just a couple of characters, that's not data that you will use, or you can aggregate the data over time. So instead of, looking at data within a particular session, you can say, I'm just going to look at the average inter-key delay for a day, right? And then that way, all those interruptions kind of wash out.
That's fascinating. I think it was really cool. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to use the 7-second rule to allow other people to throw in other questions here. Maybe the 10-second rule. You did say that, Olu, that the idea is, where do you put your effort in terms of your business case? Where did you guys put your effort, and how has the business world reacted?
Yeah, so we've decided to start with a direct-to-consumer product, with the idea that if we can get it right for the person that we feel would benefit most from this type of technology, then it can feed into the other business models. So for example, if we try to go straight to pharma or straight to a medium to large scale healthcare system, but the product is not easy to use, or is complicated or cumbersome at the consumer level, then we're not going to be able to get the data that the pharmaceutical company needs or that the clinician needs. So we figured that we need to get it right first at the consumer level, and that if we iterate on the product, getting it right at the consumer level, with a direct-to-consumer product, then we can leverage that to pursue other types of customers and other business models. So that's what we've started with. We've been fortunate to partner with the Depression Bipolar Support Alliance to get some folks to do a beta test with us of our product and give us some critical feedback that we're using to improve the product.
Can I build on that question if that's okay? Thank you for a great talk. I'm wondering, when you say I'm just kind of curious, like direct to consumer. So is it, targeting people who are worried they may have a problem? I'm just wondering, again, kind of given what you're testing and commercializing, sort of how you reach this target audience, and is there a market that people like that are interested and willing to pay for such a product? And I think it's, thank you for raising this, because I feel like thinking about these use cases is really important for us, even within academia.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. And so we envision this for folks with the lived experience of mood disorders that would benefit from a self-monitoring tool, right? So that they could see, whether they've changed medications or they've started a new therapy, how does that impact these metrics that capture, their impulse control, mood stability, processing speed, attention level. And so we feel that that is the sort of population segment that would get the most value out of what we're providing. And then it might be extended to, folks with other types of conditions, or people who are just interested in, the quantitative self movement, and they have Fitbits and Apple Watches, and this is just another tool for quantifying how they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Great. There are some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So
Maybe we can ask if
so there's a question about how the team came together.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. So the founding team is made up of myself, Dr. Rhian Moore, who's in the audience, and Dr. Alex Liao. And we basically came together sort of as an academic team first, with collaborations, and then the idea was to write an SBIR for the company around what we were doing academically. And that's how it started. And then we expanded the team to include a CEO that we hired through our connections at the University of Illinois. There was basically a kind of incubator program here at the university that he was involved in getting started. His name is Alan Baugh. And at first he was working in an advisory role with us. And then we hired him on as CEO, given his expertise working in Silicon Valley and having several successful exits. And so his sort of knowledge of the whole VC fundraising endeavor has been very helpful for us. We've recently successfully closed a seed round that will help, take our product to the next level. And we're continuing to build the team. And I guess, relevant to this audience, one of the big questions that we've received as academic co-founders is, whether are you going to leave your faculty position to do the startup full time? And personally, I've decided that I actually can better serve the company by keeping my faculty role and having our lab essentially serve as R&D for the company. And I think it's a great way to sort of shore up the scientific foundations of the company as well. And investors, seem to be okay with that argument. But then, as we grow, though, we will need more full-time staff and employees to really carry out the mission of the company.
As a follow-up to that, Ola, which is great, that was really helpful to hear, I think. I'll ask a short but really pointed question. You can decide whether to answer or not, but how much time has this been taken of yours? Like, is this Yeah, I mean, in terms of the business end of things, including
Yeah.
money raising.
Yeah, I mean, it's taken a lot of time, but you know, it's when you're you're in academia, you learn how kind of flexible work life schedules are, and so they all kind of sort of blend into each other. But it's good to have a great team to work with, and so that's made it feasible to keep my full-time faculty position, is to have great people like Rayanne to work with, and you know, and we really kind of balance out each other in terms of the workload, and so it's definitely been something that's still workable. But as I said, as the company starts to grow and as the demands of the company increase, we definitely will need more full-time folks on board. And then there's a related question that I saw in the chat about separating academic work from business. And I think that's been relatively easy because we've really worked on the business end to differentiate the product from the technology that we're using on the research side. So the app on the research side is actually called a different name. It's called BiEffect. The commercial product that we've developed for KeyWise is called Sky, and it's actually a different product altogether, even though the guts of that product come from what we've done on the research side. There are things that we've done on the company side which are very different from what we've done on the academic side. So it's easy to keep those apart, but recognizing that the scientific innovations that we develop in the lab will continuously feed into the company because we have a licensing agreement with the university.
There's a
And then related to that is the question about conflicts, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the problem. And so again, because we have this, you know, the company has actually licensed the technology from the university. That's part of the deal, right? Is that, you know, what the company has paid the university for is access to all of the intellectual property that derive from that project, from this project. So thereby that sort of, I think, mitigates issues of conflict.
Hi, this
And then-
is
and then the
Rayanne
key-
Morris.
Oh, sorry. I
Oh,
was just
yeah,
going
I
to
was just
mention,
gonna
Rhiannon,
chime in
about conflict, that you know, that part of it is just making sure that we work with our conflict of interest office, that everything gets disclosed appropriately and properly. Sorry, Rhiannon, go ahead.
That's all I was going to say, that the conflict of interest office has been incredibly helpful and has given me guidelines as an academic of what I am allowed to do in terms of using our technology in our research studies. And one is I'm not allowed to enroll participants, do the informed consent, you know, anything that would potentially induce a conflict of interest or coercion. And I'm not supposed to do analyses of the data as well. And that can help eliminate some of the perceived bias.
Yeah, likewise, I have the same arrangement through our conflict of interest office, and in all of our consent forms, the participants are made aware that I could benefit financially from the results of the scientific work that we're doing. So there was a question about diagnostic categories dependent on these signals, and whether I have any promising ideas here. I don't yet. I think it's what I mentioned was sort of more aspirational, but I think, you know, as we get more data, and as I mentioned, as there are more innovative machine learning techniques, I think that possibility is definitely on the horizon.
I think you might be selling yourself short there, Olu. I mean, I think if you think about one of the huge problems in mental health care, it's that we're always like chasing something that's already happened.
Right.
Like imagine being you know, in the infectious disease field and never being able to do prevention or other the cardiac field, and having to wait until someone has a bad heart attack before you can actually do anything. And that's kind of where we are, and is a big reason that explains the continued burden of mental and neuropsychiatric disorders. You talked about being able to actually use digital biomarkers to predict when something will happen in the future.
Right.
I wonder
Yeah, no,
whether
and I
that
think that's
raises a
really
whole
exciting.
idea
And
about diagnostics.
yeah, so I think that ability paired with something like just-in-time, adaptive interventions, I think is really exciting. And I'm doing work with one of your colleagues, Thomas Kanampalil, who's here in the audience. We're working on a Alexa-based problem-solving therapy coach, right? And so I can imagine pairing what we're doing with that project, and the app is called Lumen, with what we're doing with the digital biomarkers. And I think there's a lot of incredible synergy there, where you can come up with some kind of intervention that gets triggered based on these signals, so that you can prevent an episode from happening in the first place.
Thanks. I've heard about Lumen from the TV series, so that's great to hear about that. But I just it just seems like almost any, maybe every large scale mental health study ought to be, that's diagnosing and following people, ought to be including these digital biomarkers to get more and more data on this, because of
Yeah.
the real opportunity there that you described.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was fortunate to serve on the scientific advisory board for the Milken Institute. They're doing this large global longitudinal bipolar study, and they have a whole segment on digital biomarkers that they would like to include, which I think will provide a lot of rich data, especially for bipolar disorder, where we really don't have good ways of tracking the longitudinal course of the illness. And so they'll be combining digital biomarkers with genomics and neuroimaging and cognitive assessments. And I think having this really well characterized large sample will be really important for the field.
Other questions? I see a hand up.
Yeah. This got me thinking a little bit. In addition to the digital biomarkers of latency and gaps and things like that, I wanted to get your thoughts, and I don't know if any tech companies would be willing to give you this data, but what are your thoughts about what content is consumed by people, and if you think there's anything that could be used predictively based on consumer content?
Yeah, absolutely. We've avoided that just because of privacy and confidentiality concerns. There may be privacy preserving ways to get at content by sort of looking at meta content or doing kind of sentiment analysis on the content that people consume online. People have done that with, Twitter or Facebook posts. For example, there's this infamous Facebook emotion manipulation study that I don't know if you're familiar with, that got in trouble. It was published in PNAS, where they basically dialed up or dialed down the emotional content of your newsfeed to see if it affected the emotional content of what you posted, and it did. But if you had signed up for Facebook in 2013, you might have unwittingly been a part of that study. And so there's definitely, I think, a wealth of data to be mined from content, but I think we have to be careful about how we do it. There are even advances in machine learning, like federated learning, that allow models to learn without knowing without being able to identify who the data is coming from. And there are really some interesting studies where people have even looked at things like Instagram filters being associated with higher rates of depression, certain filters. Or you could look at certain linguistic qualities, right? So more use of first person pronouns has been associated with higher levels of depression. But for what we're doing, we're really, because people are nervous about tracking typing anyway, we're very careful about saying that, we're not tracking what people are typing.
Yeah, thank you. That answered my question. Thank you so much.
Hey, can I ask a follow-up question? So I think the mechanics and the science behind determining people going to face depression in the future, like Eric was mentioning, is important. But is there potentially a way to connect this to the point of care, right? Like, is there Are there ways? I mean, I know there's heavy lift that needs to be done with, you know, working with these big EHR vendors, but especially some of these things are even now available. You can connect your Fitbit to your MyChart account. It's fairly easy. You can do this and check, but its use in a clinical setting would depend on the tools that you've developed, right? Like in terms of translating the volumes of data into some sort of phenotype that can say, hey, this person's probably trending towards an episode that's happening. And the other part of that is that, you know, the payer systems are not set up to do the sort of monitoring or support for the physicians to keep track of this. Like, you know, there is that dual challenge. I mean, it's not that we don't have the data, but what is sort of the view on sort of translating this, not just in the by effect or the in terms of typing skills and typing differences, but also generally in terms of these mobile tools that are available in the market today.
Yeah, that's something that we've thought a lot about when thinking about developing like a clinician facing dashboard. And one of the things that we've discussed is the idea that we really don't want to create something else for a clinician to look at, right? It needs to be integrated into the things that they're already looking at. So that's one. The other is, how do you make sure that you're not just adding noise to the system, but you're providing a true signal? And I think that's possible. And I think there's ways that it can be integrated into the EHR and actually help people optimize their schedules to increase the amount of care that can be provided, right? So if I had a system in place that told me that I really don't need to see, Mr. Jones every 4 weeks, I can actually, spread him out. That gives me more space in my schedule to see somebody that's more acute that could be identified by that same system. So I think there's a lot of potential there to help us optimize how we deliver care and allow us to deliver more care in a sort of needs-based way that's data-driven.
Clearly, there's need for optimization there.
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with ridiculous wait lists and difficulty getting in, and so if we had a system that allowed us to really optimize our schedule and create room where there currently isn't any, I think that's a potentially really strong use of this type of technology.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. One other thing that I was always thinking of, that I always think about is, the keystrokes are a proxy for certain behaviors, right? Like that's how you've seen it. But the actual content also has, like you said, like the Facebook study was a classic example, right? Like Adam Kramer got in a lot of trouble for, it was on the front page of CNN saying, Facebook makes me sad, right? Like, even though that was not the intent of that study. But the content in itself may have meaning in addition to the proxies. Is there any way, I mean, I know the privacy issues are too big and you work with these big companies to anonymize the content and not look at the content at all in order to get participation. But is there potential value in going beyond the proxies of, like,
Yeah,
typing?
so a couple things. One is that I would say that the typing behavior, it might be a proxy for affect, right? But I don't think it's a proxy for cognition. Right? I think the act of typing is it's a psychomotor, cognitive, sensory motor process, right? And that's what we're tapping into. And in fact, that's sort of the premise of our R01, is to basically say, we think that what typing is doing is actually tapping into the cognitive dysfunction that we see associated with mood disorders, not the mood disorders themselves.
Okay.
Right? So and that cognition is a really important part of these affective disorders, right? Because if you have cognitive impairment persists in the euthymic state, it predicts, work done by Eric and others shown that it impacts treatment response, especially in late life depression. It impacts functional outcomes. So I think we're actually tapping into something that's really clinically important just with the typing behavior alone. That being said, I agree that there is value in content as well, but I think, as I mentioned, you just have to be careful about how that content is obtained.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's exciting to think that this multimodal assessment can also give a more fine-grained view of the cognitive aspects of mental disorders as well, which is something that we usually measure in kind of a bigger than a breadbasket, smaller than the Empire State Building way in routine clinical care.
Right.
I did, and I wanted to just point everyone towards in the chat, Allison Antes from the Center for Clinical and Research Ethics put in a link to a WashU program for learning about entrepreneurship in biomedicine. Thank you, Allison. And again, reminding people that if you have an entrepreneurial idea, if you have an idea that is for commercialization, one of the first steps, maybe the first step, is to contact the Office of Technology Management, as we heard from Dedrick Carter a few months ago. We're getting towards the top of the hour. I don't know if there are any final questions. I thought this was just a brilliantly thoughtful presentation and Q&A. And I think on behalf of all of us, wanted to thank you, Olu, for taking time out to do this.
Thanks for inviting me. It's fun to talk about this stuff. And I will also put in the chat an article that Rianne and I and Alex published not too long ago about our journey from the lab to consumers. Let me see if I can find that reference. And I'll put that in the chat, or I can send that to you, Alex, Eric.
That would be awesome. And if you can't find it right now, if you would just want to email it to me at your leisure, and I'll send it out to the group. But wanted to thank everyone. I also see there's already comments in the chat about how can we incorporate your technology and their research. So
yeah, that is possible. Let me.
Good thing to answer, because
I'll put my
I'll
put my in the spirit of our discussion, I'll put both my company and academic email addresses in the chat.
All right, excellent. And I'll try to amplify that in an email out to the group as well. I think, like I said, we're at about the end of the hour. We've learned a lot, and really, once again, appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.